The Incredibles was my first, and to date only, attempt at reviewing a movie that I don't think was bad to the core. It was simply a movie that I thought had so many problems on the surface that it made it very hard for me to get to the core. But many people tend to lump this one in with my "it's just bad" reviews that I usually do, and this is only the first of many issues here. As someone who knowingly does inflammatory reviews, I am no stranger to controversy, and naturally I can't turn around and complain about it when the result of controversy comes my way. I don't mind controversy so long as it's directed at my actual standpoints, but for many reasons, most of which I know were entirely my fault, this review caused people to become outraged over positions that I didn't actually take with regard to the film. I thought about a number of ways to approach this, but finally decided on this one. So without further ado, I give you the top 5 most common misunderstandings about my Incredibles review. Number 5. I hated the movie. Since I went out of my way in the review to note that I didn't hate the movie, this one should be a no-brainer. Moving on. Number 4. The movie should have been for babies. One of the main reasons I didn't like The Incredibles was its unbalanced kid-to-adult ratio, but for one reason or another, people took that to mean that I thought the movie should have been this. This seems to be down to the fact that I referred to The Incredibles as a kids' movie or a children's movie. I've made this clarification in a few other places since then, but I think this would be best to finally add it to the official review. Since the late 90s, children's films have changed extraordinarily. Movies for kids used to be viewed in the framework of simple entertainment. Today, there are almost no children's movies like that. They almost all have something to offer for everyone, and when they don't, we usually don't bother to see those movies because giving everyone something to enjoy and think about has become the standard now. I use the term children's film because I honestly didn't know that people even use that term to mean just for kids anymore. When I think of just for kids, I think of something like The Lion King 1.5 or We're Back, a Dinosaur Story. People just don't make films like that anymore by and large, and Pixar never has. My problem with The Incredibles was not that it wasn't exclusively for kids with no adult themes or actions at all. My problem is with that kid-to-adult ratio that Pixar is famous for nailing time and again. I've heard this 1,000 times since my review was released. It doesn't mean that it's just for kids just because it was a cartoon, and that is absolutely true. But it doesn't mean that it's just for adults because it's a cartoon either. Who these movies are intended for is largely going to depend on who's making them and who's distributing them. DiC doesn't have a great reputation for producing particularly sophisticated children's programming, although yes, I know there are exceptions. When you see DiC, you know you're not going to see the next Toy Story. By contrast, when you see something called Sullivan Bluth Studios, you know you're probably going to have to think a little bit harder as to what age your child should be before entering that film. That's not a bad thing because, by and large, you know what to expect by now from Bluth. Good films, for the most part, that are really going to push those boundaries and take those creative risks. By that logic, you don't expect Pixar to produce the next heavy metal movie, and we would all stand in shock with our jaws on the floor if they did. But you also don't expect them to make the next Teletubbies movie either. Pixar makes movies that are neither just for kids nor just for adults. But when I go into a Pixar movie, I expect to see something balanced between those two extremes. That's where they really dropped the ball for me on this one. It definitely pushed that envelope for having lots in there for adults, but I think it sacrifices a lot of the fun that could have been had with this idea as well. But did I want this to be the next Teletubbies movie? Absolutely not. Number 3. The movie was too adult. I know that this kind of sounds like a repeat of number 4, but it's actually not. Imagine this for a moment, if you will. You go to a restaurant and order yourself a steak medium well. The waiter brings you your food, and it's raw. You tell the waiter about this, only to have him reply with the following. "Oh, I'm sorry, did you want us to burn the shit out of it for you?" Obviously, you don't want them to burn the shit out of it for you, you just want them to cook your steak properly, and this is a good example of that extreme argument. If you didn't like one extreme, that must automatically mean that you wanted the other extreme. If something has too much of one thing, you must want it to have too much of another thing. In the case of my thinking that The Incredibles was a bit too depressing, people have taken that to mean that I wanted it to all be happiness and sunshine all the time. But there is another implication in the steak analogy. The waiter seems to be implying that the problem is not that I wanted my steak cooked properly, but that I wanted it cooked at all. So too, in my Incredibles review, people have determined that my problem was not that there was too much cynicism and depressing aspects that they have labeled adult, but rather that there was anything adult in the movie, period. And again, the answer to this misunderstanding is balance, 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 which again is one of Pixar's usual specialties. Every Pixar film has those tense and sometimes depressing moments, with maybe the possible exception of Cars. But they always come from behind and pick up the slack. Or even forget Pixar for a moment, you know what movie struck a perfect balance between tense and enjoyable? The Lion King. Seriously. There are so many serious and perilous things in The Lion King, it's just unbelievable. But they always balance it off with something fun and lighthearted just in the nick of time, so that we're not constantly stuck in one depressing place. I honestly think The Lion King is a good model for how to strike that balance well in a more sophisticated children's film. The Incredibles spends the first 2 acts with these characters down and nearly out, and they only get it back in the last half of the last third. There are pieces in this film that give us something lighthearted, like the Edna character, whom I loved, but not enough to call this a truly balanced and well-crafted Pixar film. But the fact that adult things exist in the movie is certainly not what's wrong with it. Number 2. The movie was too dark. This misunderstanding wouldn't have bothered me so much if it weren't for the fact that not only did I never use the word dark to describe a problem I had with the film, but I actually named the 3 things that I thought the film was: cynical, depressing, and mean-spirited. These 3 things have the side effect of being dark, but having dark aspects in the film, period, is not what this movie's problem was. Ladies and gentlemen, there has never been a darker children's film than The Secret of NIMH. And that film was fucking amazing. But The Secret of NIMH was not cynical. It was actually very optimistic. It was not depressing. Okay, a lot of the time it was, but there were many other factors that supplement that feeling. And it certainly was not mean-spirited, or if it was just as uplifting at the same time in various ways. Being dark does not automatically mean that the film has a problem. It's only when the aspects that make it dark are not supplemented with anything. Once again, it all comes back to balance. And the number 1 most common misunderstanding about my Incredibles review? The movie wasn't good for kids. This one really bothers me because based on this one misunderstanding, I have inadvertently caused my audience to associate me with a group that I personally despise. People took my review to mean that I think The Incredibles is bad for kids, and I kind of meant that, but not in the way people thought. By most people's interpretation of being bad for kids, they did something that has kept me up at nights. Something that has made an imaginary puppet of me who mouths a false advocacy for a group of people that I loathe. When people take my review to mean that I think The Incredibles is bad for kids, they group me in with those people. The Think of the Children group is one of the most reactionary, paranoid, wrong group of people I have ever had the displeasure of listening to. I'm not talking about the parents who think about whether or not it's a good idea to take their younger kids to intense movies. That really comes down to a responsible decision and a personal judgment. I'm talking about the people who think that kid and adolescent entertainment is going to irrevocably fuck them up. Violent movies, violent video games, violent television, graphic music, it's all been blamed for corrupting our youth, and sometimes even blamed for some really horrible things that our youth has done. And it's all bullshit. I firmly believe that while it might not be appropriate to do so, you could expose a kid to all manner of violent art forms and still have them turn out to be an upstanding person in the community. In fact, I have at least one experience that indicates this. A friend of mine had a kid that, when I first met him, was around 12 years old. And that kid today is 24. This kid had no restrictions on what kind of movies, music, or video games he could enjoy, and naturally he partook of all the adult stuff. But today, 12 years later, that guy's fine. He's the least violent and most compassionate person I know. His only major problem is that he's really just kinda lazy. The thing that these moron loons need to do is to start making a distinction between inappropriate and detrimental. Something can be inappropriate for our youth without it automatically being damaging to their character. And I think that's the case with almost all forms of art. Maybe 5 years old is a little too young to be coming to terms with the fact that Bambi's mom was shot to death. I don't know, I'm not a parent. But I do know that even if that does negatively affect the 5-year-old, that effect is going to be short-term. It's not going to cause a sociologically deficient human being. No art can cause that. If you're playing Grand Theft Auto 4 and this inspires you to go out and pull people out of their cars and beat them, you already have to be a pretty fucked up person to be able to participate in something like that. There are so many other factors that play into that kind of thing, but Grand Theft Auto 4 is not the fucking cause. But rather than blaming some of the obvious and more down-to-earth culprits, like, say, poverty, these people will always blame entertainment for society's woes. Why? Because it relieves the society that they are responsible for of all responsibility. Even if I do think that some of the stuff in The Incredibles is bad for kids, that doesn't mean that I think it's going to screw them up. I don't think movies are capable of that. And let's not forget that The Incredibles is rated PG, which lets people know that bringing the little ones to this film may require an extra bit of decision-making. They aren't trying to sell screw-up juice to our kids, and I never meant to imply that I thought they were. If you think the rating system is necessary, then we should all be perfectly happy with the rating of this film. In fact, that's one thing that's really getting on my nerves lately. The ratings for children's movies are starting to not make any goddamn sense. The Secret of NIMH was rated G, which, if you believe in the rating systems, is just ridiculous, but let's look at more modern movies. Toy Story 3 was rated G. Now, in my opinion, Toy Story 3 is the best film Pixar ever made, and the incinerator scene is the best scene they've ever produced. It solidified what these characters all mean to each other, the bond they have, and everything that they have been through together was captured in that moment. But this scene alone should have warranted a PG rating, if only to give parents a chance to make an informed decision. When I saw this film for the second time, there was a parent behind me who had a child that was very, very young. And when this scene came around, I heard this little girl ask her mom why the toys were holding hands. I would hate to have to be the one to tell that kid that the reason they're holding hands is because they're all about to die. Now, that's a decision that all parents need to make for themselves, but giving this movie a G rating doesn't allow for them to make an informed decision on that one. But get this. Tangled was rated PG. Tangled! There isn't a single goddamn thing in this movie that warrants that. We have one off-camera stabbing that lasts about 2 seconds, and the briefest shot of blood that you can barely make out. It makes absolutely no goddamn sense to make parents second-guess bringing their younger kids to this particular film. But I've kind of gotten off the subject here, so let me get back to point. The Incredibles is not a bad movie, and it is certainly not a damaging movie that's going to warp our youth. Hopefully this clarification video will make it easier for people to understand what I was really trying to say in that review, and maybe it'll take some of the pressure off of the hate mailbox for a while. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening.